Hi, thanks for coming back to listen to the show. Before we get started today, I just wanted to share a story that I think is so incredible and I thought you should know too. Yesterday, I drove up to Phoenix, Arizona to go to a meeting for a grief support group for grieving parents who believe in the afterlife. It's called Helping Parents Heal. And I'm not going to talk about anything that happened at that meeting because it's confidential, as all support groups should be. When I was there, we broke out into small groups, everybody counting off 1 to 4 to get randomly assigned to a small group. And I remember thinking that I really wanted to be grouped with these 2 women in particular who were leaders in the group, that I was interested to know more about their story. But as I had that thought, and they were still sounding off in the room, I also thought to myself, Whitney, you know the universe is going to put you in whatever small group you're meant to be in. And when I sat down in the small group, there was one man in particular that I noticed right away because he was a cowboy. And I'm not talking like a cowboy just walked out of Boot Barn and his boots had never seen dirt cowboy, like somebody who clearly has worked on a ranch. And my family has a background in ranching in a small town that I remember so fondly because my great-grandmother lived out there at the ranch and I used to visit when I was a kid. And my family doesn't live out there anymore, but some of the extended family does. And so after the small group was over, I approached him and asked if he was from the Phoenix area. And he said no and explained that his family has a long ranching background. And so I mentioned the name of the small town where my family was from, which I looked up the population for reference because when I say small, I think the stats I found are pretty accurate in saying there's less than 10,000 people in the general area of this ranching community. And meanwhile, Phoenix has over 4.5 million people. And when he heard the name of the town, he was astounded. He said his mom had been born there and then proceeded to tell me that the extended family that still lives on my family's ranch just called him about a year ago shopping for a horse. I mean, seriously, the odds are so infinitesimal that this interaction would have happened. But I believe that was a soul plan, that we were meant to meet that day in that random place and have that crazy connection. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. Welcome to the Selfish Griever podcast. I'm the host, Whitney. This is a podcast for grieving parents looking for spiritual support on their grief journey as they find their purpose after loss. We're a community for grievers discussing all aspects of the grief journey, connecting with your deceased child, and spirituality. I've been a grieving mom since June 2020 when my firstborn twin son, Orion, died in an accident when he was 2 years old. Here on this podcast, you'll hear interviews with grievers on similar paths and experts in spirituality. Welcome to the Selfish Griever community. Hi, welcome to the Selfish Griever podcast. Today's episode, I had initially planned to discuss grief support, but after my interview last Friday with Lisa, the grieving mom who became a grief coach, where we ended up talking about soul planning, I had such a big response from listeners and grieving parents on my Instagram that it felt like I was meant to talk about this instead today. For those of you who don't know, soul planning is a concept that ties into the idea that we don't just live one life. We reincarnate and come back for multiple lifetimes, and every lifetime our soul has a goal of something we want to learn and grow through. And those can vary widely from growing through adversity to sometimes just enjoying a beautiful life and your soul grows, experiencing love and positive things. And soul planning was not a concept that I was familiar with before my son Orion died. But I ended up finding a particular author named Dr. Weiss, who ended up writing 8 books on the subject. And I was fascinated when I read his first book, Many Lives, Many Masters. And I was fascinated for quite a few reasons. But the first reason is because Dr. Weiss is a psychiatrist and he's Ivy League educated. And most importantly, he was a skeptic. He did not have a religious background and he views himself as a scientist, so he's prone to logic and empirical data. And much like a lot of people's soul plans, his journey into reincarnation started in a way that he never anticipated. He talks about it in the first book, Many Lives, Many Masters, but for a synthesized version here, basically he had a patient whom he refers to as Catherine that he was treating with hypnotherapy, and he basically unintentionally took her back to a past life. And he didn't believe it at first, but through the progression of their repeated appointments, more and more incredible information was coming through in details that he just found to be astounding. And sure, you could say that it was her having dreams or fantasizing. And I'm not here to convince anybody. I'm just thinking about the things I thought when I was first exposed to his book. But he explained there was also another phenomenon. When she would be in a trance-like state, sometimes she would go to the in-between place, between her lifetimes, the other side. And when she was there, she frequently would channel messages from a source that calls themselves the Masters. And these messages would be beautifully deep about life in general. And while Catherine would remember all the past lives that she experienced whenever she came out of the trance, and frequently even remembered additional details that she hadn't mentioned while in the trance, she never remembered the messages that came through from the Masters. And Dr. Weiss concluded that was because that wasn't her speaking, that was her channeling information from the other side. Dr. Weiss met Catherine in 1980. And one of the psychic messages that came through and convinced him beyond a doubt that this wasn't her speaking was knowledge about his son, who'd passed away 9 years prior as an infant when he was 23 days old. She said in her channeled message, "Your son's heart was also important, for it was backward, like a chicken's. He made a great sacrifice for you out of his love. His soul is very advanced. His death satisfied his parents' debts. Also, he wanted to show you that medicine could only go so far, that its scope is very limited." Because even though Dr. Weiss was a doctor and serving his residency in a medical school when his firstborn son Adam was born, he wasn't able to do anything to save him. It turned out his son had been born with a complicated pulmonary defect that it's quoted in the book saying occurs approximately once in every 10 million births. And if you think about this, at a time before social media, really it was probably just print newspapers. There's no way that Catherine could have known that, down to that detail, about something so private for Dr. Weiss. And I think as grieving parents, most of us could relate to how impressionable that would be for somebody to tell us something so private about a child of ours that had died. Dr. Weiss describes that although he started to believe in this amazing concept of reincarnation and past lives, he would still sometimes forget the power of what he had been experiencing when he would get caught up in the everyday motions of life. But over time, he noticed that he started to become a different person. He described himself as becoming more calm and patient. He was more peaceful. He felt more hope, more joy, more purpose, and more satisfaction in his life. He's quoted as saying, "I was less afraid of losing others, even though I would certainly miss them. It dawned on me that I was losing the fear of death." I resonate with that quote so much because after I learned about soul planning, it just gave me such a new perspective on not just Orion's death, but all the ways that our lives are interconnected together in an intentional manner, and that things are happening the way that they were meant to. And I don't have any control. I definitely don't have any way to predict what's going to happen. But when I started looking around at my life and observing the things we frequently call coincidences, and considering that maybe that wasn't a coincidence, but it was meant to be that way, I think that gave me the most comfort because I stopped fearing that I was messing up. I like to have control. I'm a very type A personality. But Orion's death was something that made me face the harsh reality that I don't have any control. And nobody does, ultimately. And that's scary. But not having control doesn't mean that life is complete chaos. And that's the part that's comforting to me. There's something that's set in place long before I was born that's a path that I'm meant to be following. And it wasn't set in place by somebody else. It wasn't decided for my benefit. That's really the beauty of the concept of soul planning, is that your soul collaborated with other souls that are on your journey and guides on the other side to master plan this experience that you're having here called life. You made these choices for yourself. And while that's hard to imagine, because who would ever choose to have their child die? It's also somewhat empowering because that means there was not some higher power who forced this on me. I wasn't subjected to Orion's death. It was something agreed upon between my soul and his brother's soul and his dad's soul and a lot of other souls, that it would happen. And for a purpose, to give all of our souls an opportunity to learn and grow through things that each one of us needs to learn and grow through. Nobody has the same grief journey, and nobody has the same lessons that they learn. And really, Dr. Weiss's books talk about that. His first book, Many Lives, Many Masters, is all about the experiences with PATRON, who had 86 different past lives and learned different lessons in each of those. But in observing Catherine's recollection of multiple past lives, Dr. Weiss realized not only that each lifetime is intended to learn a specific purpose, but there were souls that she would have contact with in different capacities, sometimes as teachers, sometimes as her father, sometimes as her brother, who showed up repeatedly in lifetime after lifetime. And he calls those soul groups. Souls that we agree to come back repeatedly and be in their lives and they in ours in different capacities to help all of us grow collectively. And what a comforting thought that this lifetime with my son Orion, that was limited to just 2 years, is not the only chance I'm going to get to have him be part of my life. He also observed in the recounting of each of her past lives that they would vary greatly in terms of her perception of the afterlife and death, but every time her death itself was pretty much the same. There would come a moment that she would describe where her consciousness left her body, floated above, and then would be drawn to this beautiful light. And it happened that way in every single lifetime. I don't know about you, but I've thought a lot about what Orion's final moments were like. You worry if they were scared or if they felt pain. It was comforting because that's not something I personally know anything about. And so to read this and hear somebody who provided so much other supporting evidence to lead me to believe that her experiences were real and legitimate, and then hear her recount in a lot of different lifetimes what it was like when she died, and that it wasn't a scary, horrible experience. It was peaceful and loving, moving to the next plane. After Dr. Weiss's experiences with Catherine and all the knowledge that he gained from their sessions, he really couldn't keep it all to himself. It's true, he didn't publish the book until 8 years later, and he talks about that he worried about his reputation as an esteemed doctor, being criticized for what a lot of people would call these crazy beliefs about reincarnation. But ultimately, he couldn't deny the change that had happened in him and his wife from being exposed to all of this knowledge. And so he went on to teach people about the messages that he received from the masters. And he wrote another book called Messages from the Masters, Tapping into the Power of Love. This actually was the 4th book that he wrote, but it's this next one that I read, After Many Lives, Many Masters. It was published in 2000. I also have the audiobook, which is really good because Dr. Weiss narrates it himself. So I highly recommend, if you like audiobooks, to listen to that because you really hear him talking about it. And you hear him discussing what some of the hypnotherapy sessions are like, which I think helps remove some of the mysticism of it. It's not a crazy seance happening. It's really just a normal hypnotherapy appointment that still ends up resulting in this incredible information. And so Messages from the Masters is the premise of teaching what he teaches in his workshops, which is how people can live their life more mindfully. He specifically highly recommends meditating. He says that that's how you can reach this higher level of consciousness yourself. And he admits that he himself struggles with meditating on a consistent basis, even though he knows the power of it. And I can completely relate to that because we are human and we still have to live life here on earth, and that isn't always conducive to meditating. But I personally practice transcendental meditation. It took me a while to discover this meditation style. I tried a lot of different things and free YouTube videos. And early on in my grief, I think it was easier for me to meditate in a way because I was so singularly focused on my grief and finding answers and feeling connection. And I blocked out everything else in my life because I couldn't handle all the other things at that point. But as my grief journey progressed and I had to start stepping back into my life and the responsibilities and the daily tasks that need to get done, it got harder for me to reach that quiet place in my mind. And so eventually I found transcendental meditation. But transcendental meditation is not at all affiliated with spirituality or any religion. It's simply about clearing your mind. And it's been tremendously helpful for me. And even though I know that and I've witnessed the benefits, I too am guilty of not consistently doing it. In fact, I tried to do a 100-day meditation challenge at the beginning of the year, and I failed horribly. I think I made it like 7 consecutive days, if that. And for my personality, I realized it's because when I try and force myself to do things, then I tend to naturally rebel. But when I just remember how much it benefits me, and if I could just find 20 minutes a day, then it makes a difference. The last book that I want to talk about today before we part ways for this episode is Miracles Happen: The Transformational Healing Power of Past Life Memories. Dr. Weiss wrote this along with his daughter Amy and published it in 2012. Because what happened after his amazing experience with Catherine is that he went on to treat over 4,000 individual people in past life regressions. In addition to multiple large group workshops that he conducted doing past life regressions en masse, everyone at once. And the results of all the beautiful experiences that he witnessed and the lessons that people learned is this book, a compilation of testimonies from people who've experienced past life regression therapy themselves and had really miraculous changes in their life. And this may be the best book because you can read it and see how people benefited. But I think the most notable chapter of the book for you to know about is chapter 6. It's titled Letting Go of Grief. And as I mentioned before, Dr. Weiss himself is a grieving dad. He describes in the beginning of the chapter about how little he knew about spirituality and the afterlife when his son passed away. And here he says specifically, I grieved after the death of my father also, but more so upon losing Adam. For the loss of a child is an aberration from the natural order of things. All one's hopes are dashed, the heart is torn, the pain is immeasurable and unspeakable. I know its depths firsthand, so I can empathize completely with others who are going through the process. I have learned that our loved ones live on, that they are simply on the other side, and that we will meet them again and again. When the fear of loss and death is removed, grief ceases to be so suffocating. This chapter is a collection of 5 stories that specifically demonstrate how the past life regressions that gave these grievers such wisdom helped them on their grief journey. And so I think that's why I particularly resonated with this book. And personally, I'm glad the order that I happened to read these books in, because the first one, Many Lives, Many Masters, really explained first the foundation of how Dr. Weiss was even originally exposed and introduced to this theory, and how his process was established through his practice with Catherine. And the second is all of the important messages that he compiles together from the masters themselves, which, any way you want to break it down, are just wisdom, things that anybody should consider and try and live by. And finally, the book Miracles Happen is proof and stories of those people who are trying to live by those messages. So if you've ever wanted to know more about soul planning, there are definitely a lot of resources out there. And even Dr. Weiss himself states in the beginning of Messages from the Masters that as he was getting ready to write it, he wondered why he should even be doing this, because there are so many books out there about spirituality. He's definitely not the only one speaking about reincarnation and past lives. But he recognized that everybody learns differently, and so maybe the way he explains it will resonate more than the way someone else does, even though they're all saying the same message. This quote from the book Messages from the Masters, I think pretty much sums up everything that you need to know about soul planning. And it says, although every human being has a life plan, we also have free will, as do our parents and everyone with whom we interact. Our lives and theirs will be affected by the choices we make while in physical state, but the destiny points will still occur. We will meet the people we had planned to meet, and we will face the opportunities and obstacles that we had planned long before our births. How we handle these meetings, however, our reactions and subsequent decisions, are the expressions of our free will. Destiny and free will coexist and interact all the time. They are complementary, not contradictory. And for me on my grief journey, that's been such a pivotal concept to understand, because I couldn't have done anything to stop Orion's death. And I can't guarantee that there won't be more hard things that happen in my future. But being stuck in grief is not my destiny. It's a choice. And it's not an easy choice. And it's not one you just make once. It's a small choice you make every day to keep moving forward, to find hope, to try and learn and be a better person, live a better life. It doesn't mean that there aren't still hard days. There's a lot of valleys in between the peaks. But it's knowing that I won't always be in the valley, because I make the choice to climb to the peak. Thank you for listening to the Selfish Griever podcast. I really hope that you enjoyed this episode and that it maybe made you think about some things you hadn't thought about before. If you did enjoy it, please leave me a rating and a review about your thoughts of the episode. I really love getting to read them. You can find me on Instagram at theselfishgriever, or you can email me at theselfishgriever@aol.com. Unfortunately, my website is currently under construction, but hopefully will be launched in the next couple weeks, and I'm so excited to get to share that with you guys as a resource for more information, a searchable directory of all my podcast episodes, and finally, a way to contact me. Thank you.